Letter 15 of the Backwoods of Canada, by Catherine Parr Traill. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Backwoods of Canada, by Catherine Parr Traill. Letter 15. Recapitulation of various topics. September the 20th, 1834. I promised when I parted from you before I left England to write as soon as I could give you any satisfactory account of our settlement in this country. I shall do my best to redeem that promise, and forward you a slight sketch of our proceedings, with such remarks on the natural features of the place in which we have fixed our abode, as I think likely to afford you interest or amusement. Perhaps your patience, then, my dear friend, for a long and rambling epistle, in which I may possibly prove somewhat of a will o' wisp, and having made you follow me in my desultory wanderings, over hill, over dale, through bush, through brier, over park, over pale, through flood, through fire, possibly leave you in the midst of a big cedar swamp, or among the pathless mazes of our wild woods, without a clue to guide you, or even a blaze to light you on your way. You will have heard, through my letters to my dear mother, of our safe arrival at Quebec, of my illness at Montreal, of all our adventures and misadventures during our journey up the country, till after much weary wandering we finally found a home and resting place with a kind relative, whom it was our happiness to meet after separation of many years. My husband was anxious to settle in the neighbourhood of one so nearly connected with me, thinking it would rob the woods of some of the loneliness that most women complain so bitterly of. He purchased a lot of land on the shores of a beautiful lake, one of a chain of small lakes belonging to the Otanabee river. Here, then, we are established, having now some 25 acres cleared, and a nice house built. Our situation is very agreeable, and each day increases its value. When we first came up to live in the bush, with the exception of S , here were but 2 or 3 settlers near us, and no roads cut out. The only road that was available for bringing up goods from the nearest town was on the opposite side of the water, which was obliged to be crossed on a log or birch bark canoe; the former nothing better than a large pine log hollowed with the axe, so as to contain 3 or 4 persons. It is flat bottomed and very narrow, on which account it is much used on these shallow waters. The birch canoe is made of sheets of birch bark, ingeniously fashioned and sewn together by the Indians with the tough roots of the cedar, young pine, or larch tamarack, as it is termed by the Indians. It is exceedingly light, so that it can be carried by 2 persons easily, or even by one. These, then, were our ferry boats, and very frail they are, and require great nicety in their management. They are worked in the water with paddles, either kneeling or standing. The squaws are very expert in the management of the canoes, and preserve their balance with admirable skill, standing up while they impel the little bark with great velocity through the water. Very great is the change that a few years have effected in our situation. A number of highly respectable settlers have purchased land along the shores of these lakes, so that we no longer want society. The roads are now cut several miles above us, and though far from good, can be travelled by wagons and sleighs, and are, at all events, better than none. A village has started up where formerly a thick pine wood covered the ground. We have now within a short distance of us an excellent saw mill, a grist mill, and store, with a large tavern and many good dwellings. A fine timber bridge on stone piers was erected last year to connect the opposite townships, and lessen the distance to and from Peterborough; and though it was unfortunately swept away early last spring by the unusual rising of the Otanabee lakes, a new and more substantial one has risen upon the ruins of the former, through the activity of an enterprising young Scotchman, the founder of the village. But the grand work that is, sooner or later, to raise this portion of the district from its present obscurity is the opening a line of navigation from Lake Huron through Lake Simcoe, and so through our chain of small lakes to Rice Lake. and finally through the Trent to the Bay of Quinte. This noble work would prove of incalculable advantage by opening a direct communication between Lake Huron and the inland townships at the back of the Ontario with the St. Lawrence. This project has already been under the consideration of the governor, and it is at present exciting great interest in the country. Sooner or later there is little doubt but that it will be carried into effect. It presents some difficulties and expense, but it would be greatly to the advantage and prosperity of the country, and be the means of settling many of the back townships bordering upon these lakes. I must leave it to abler persons than myself to discuss at large the policy and expediency of the measure; but as I suppose you have no intention of emigrating to our backwoods, you will be contented with my cursory view of the matter, and believe, as in friendship you are bound to do, that it is a desirable thing to open a market for inland produce. Canada is the land of hope. Here everything is new, everything going forward. It is scarcely possible for arts, sciences, agriculture, manufactures, to retrograde. They must keep advancing, though in some situations the progress may seem slow, in others they are proportionably rapid. There is a constant excitement on the minds of emigrants, particularly in the partially settled townships, that greatly assists in keeping them from desponding. The arrival of some enterprising person gives a stimulus to those about him. A profitable speculation is started, and lo, the value of the land in the vicinity rises to double and treble what it was thought worth before; so that, without any design of befriending his neighbours, the schemes of one settler being carried into effect shall benefit a great number. We have already felt the beneficial effect of the access of respectable emigrants locating themselves in this township, as it has already increased the value of our land in a threefold degree. All this, my dear friend, you will say is very well, and might afford subject for wise discussion between grave men, but will hardly amuse us women. So pray turn to some other theme, and just tell me how you contrive to pass your time among the bears and wolves of Canada. One lovely day last June I went by water to visit the bride of a young naval officer, who had purchased a very pretty lot of land some 2 miles higher up the lake. Our party consisted of my husband, baby, and myself. We met a few pleasant friends, and enjoyed our excursion much. Dinner was laid out in the "stoop," which, as you may not know what is meant by the word, I must tell you that it means a sort of wide verandah, supported on pillars, often of unbarked logs. The floor is either of earth beaten hard or plank, the roof covered with sheets of bark or else shingled. These stoops are of Dutch origin, and were introduced, I have been told, by the first Dutch settlers in the States, since which they have found their way all over the colonies. Wreathed with the scarlet creeper, a native plant of our woods and wilds, the wild vine, and also with the hop, which here grows luxuriantly, with no labour or attention to its culture, these stoops have a very rural appearance, in summer serving the purpose of an open anteroom, in which you can take your meals and enjoy the fanning breeze without being inconvenienced by the extreme heat of the noonday sun. The situation of the house was remarkably well chosen, just on the summit of a little elevated plain, the ground sloping with a steep descent to a little valley, at the bottom of which a bright rill of water divided the garden from the opposite cornfields, which clothed a corresponding bank. In front of the stoop, where we dined, the garden was laid out with a smooth plot of grass, surrounded with borders of flowers, and separated from a ripening field of wheat by a light railed fence, over which the luxuriant hop vine flung its tendrils and graceful blossoms. Now I must tell you the hop is cultivated for the purposes of making a barm for raising bread. As you take great interest in housewifery concerns, I shall send you a recipe for what we call hop rising. See Appendix. The Yankees use a fermentation of salt, flour, and warm water or milk; but though the salt rising makes beautiful bread to look at, being far whiter and firmer than the hop yeast bread, there is a peculiar flavour imparted to the flour that does not please every one's taste, and it is very difficult